it's episode 40, and it's time we got back to a little mini-series, a 5-parter on the Manchester Bridge that's been written by our friend Historidan. So if you had the ability or the desire to do so, you were to take a boat down the Monongahela River from the city of Pittsburgh, you would come across the remnants of Pittsburgh's once great steel empire, where massive factories employing tens of thousands of people once stood. There now stands an outdoor shopping mall, or in many cases, the empty husks of those factories, long since condemned to live out their existence as ever-rusting tributes to an industrial past. But if you made it far enough down the river, you would come across one of the few remaining steel mills in the Pittsburgh area, in the small town of Braddock, Pennsylvania. An easier way, of course, of getting to the town, however, would simply be to take PA Route 130, where you would come across the last vestige of Andrew Carnegie's Pittsburgh empire, the Edgar Thomson Steelworks, and the statue in front of the entrance of folk hero Joe Magarac. In 1872, Andrew Carnegie, already the head of a burgeoning railroad empire, sought to build a new steel mill, one that would utilize the new and highly efficient Bessemer process to make its steel. Carnegie selected a site along the Monongahela River, which would both give access to raw materials like the coal and coke from Connellsville's coal beds, while at the same time allowing for easy transportation downriver to Pittsburgh itself. Well, upriver, technically, whatever. Ground officially broke in 1873 with the Edgar Thomson Works, named for Carnegie mentor and former head of Pittsburgh Railroad, become one of the largest and most productive steel mills in the world. That productivity, though, came at a price. Workers in Carnegie's plants were subjected to some of the most deadly working conditions in the expanding industrial centers of the U.S. And for all this, the workers were paid a pittance, even well below what the market could bear. As steel became the dominant industry across Pittsburgh in the late 19th century, the workers began to realize they were getting the short end of the money stick. This was, after all, the era of the robber barons, and the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, and to a larger extent his business manager Henry Clay Frick, represented at that time some of the worst excesses of the Gilded Age. While Frick and Carnegie were living posh lifestyles, the workers were working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week and still were barely able to afford to live. All this came to a head in 1892 with one of the largest labor battles in American history, the Battle of Homestead. Although they weren't the largest mill in Carnegie's operation, the workers at the Edgar Thomson Works suffered lower wages throughout the summer of 1892, just as their brethren at the Duquesne and Homestead Works did. Collectively, all three mills went on strike in August of that year, resulting in one of the deadliest labor conflicts in American history. Another story for perhaps another time. While the battle itself took place at Carnegie's Homestead Works about 2 miles upriver, workers at all three mills owned by Carnegie suffered as a result. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, the union overseeing these mills, was effectively broken, and even the small positives that had been won by the union were quickly done away with. Life, in short, had become increasingly difficult for the workers, with very few positives to look forward to. It was during this time then, roughly around the turn of the century, that a legendary man among the steel workers and their families began to arise. This is a fairly common phenomenon across the American working class of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. As working conditions were downright awful, workers began to invest time and energy into stories that they could pass amongst themselves. Stories of men bigger, stronger, and more powerful than 10 men, who not only came into existence because of an almost magical means, but also then left as a result of self-sacrifice, in doing so, showing the workers that their sacrifices were worth the effort that they had put forth. Some classic examples of this include John Henry, railroad workers, Paul Bunyan of the lumberjack fame, and for steel workers, they turned to the legend of steelworker Joe Magarac. Magarac, his legend says, was born of pure iron ore, pulled from the hills and raised in a blast furnace. Joe, it was said, was of Eastern European descent. Croatia seemed to be the most common country of origin, although Czechoslovakia has been mentioned before as well, not unlike many of the workers themselves being Eastern European. Like all American tall tales, Magarac was said to have been physically imposing, 7 feet tall, although some say that he was as tall as the smokestacks of the mills himself, with a physical strength of 20 men. According to legends, he could work 24 hours a day at the mill, squeezing the molten steel into railroad rails or creating steel beams from red-hot ingots. Ingots? I'm not really sure. Other tales of Joe Magarac gel with the experiences of the workers and the oftentimes difficult and sometimes deadly nature of their work. As the story goes, as Joe worked, he saw a ladle of steel falling from its crane with dozens of workers beneath. Joe, using his strength and size, caught the ladle without dropping a single drop or splashing anybody. An additional story goes that a train car full of hot molten ingots, there's that word again, ingots, broke loose and was rapidly careening downhill towards a group of workers, just as he had in the previous story. Magarac caught the train cars in the nick of time, preventing the loss of life, but also property. Individually, these stories seem to be silly narratives that could be told to children growing up, harmless stories at that. The reality, however, is that those stories could be told to release the tension that workers and the workers' families could experience on a daily basis. The lives of these workers, as far as the bosses were concerned, were cheap and easy to replace. Life in the mills could be capricious. Industrial accidents were commonplace, and in the case of tons of molten steel falling on workers, many times there was little left, if anything at all, to be buried. Like all American tall tales, these stories could be used as both comfort and an explanation for the daily drudgery faced by workers. Gradually, Joe Magarac became interwoven into the culture of all western Pennsylvania, and indeed much of the industrial Midwest. Images and statues of Joe began to pop up all over major industrial cities as a totem of sorts to industrial workers. Joe Magarac became synonymous with the spirit of the American worker, an indefatigable work ethic coupled with the desire to do right by the workers themselves. The spirit allowed for the unprecedented growth in the American steel industry between 1930 and 1970, and the lives of the workers were becoming significantly better. The glory was not to last forever. By the 1970s, the American steel industry showed significant weaknesses, including the factories falling behind in their international rivals, and those workers being paid exceptionally well. Carnegie Steel's successor, U.S. Steel, started to fall into decline by the 1980s, closing the Homestead Works in 1986. And Charles Bradford, an analyst from Merrill Lynch, said of the Thompson Works that it wouldn't survive the year, adding, "It's not a world-class plant, and the company can't afford to make it one." The plant did survive, however, and to this day continues to be one of the last vestiges of the once great Pittsburgh steel industry. Although this is where we pick back up with Joe Magarac. As I mentioned before, one of the hallmarks of American folklore, tall tales, is the notion of self-sacrifice, demonstrating how the sacrifice of the workers could be worth it all in the end. And for Joe Magarac, there are two possible endings to his story. As one legend goes, the workers, realizing they were out of iron ore to continue production, turned to Joe, who, as he was made of iron ore, allowed himself to be melted down into steel beams to be used for building the next great American building project. The second story, and possibly more relevant to the city of Braddock, a town that has seen severe economic downturn since the end of the mills. In fact, there was in Rolling Stone in the early mid-2000s, I recall, they did a story on then mayor, who I believe, well, he's certainly still involved in politics, labeling him the mayor of hell. Such is the national reverence for Braddock. Anyway, the second story, the more relevant one to Braddock, is that Joe simply walked away from the mills, realizing that the mills and the workers had passed him by. Joe retreated to an abandoned mill where he sits to this day, awaiting the upswing in steel production once more. As mentioned before, this is the third part of a 5-part series, a series for which we have been slightly delayed. But the next installment also focuses on a piece of American folklore. Unlike Joe Magarac, though, next episode's character is both a fictional character but based on a terrible and altogether real event. The next time on this Manchester Bridge series, we will take a look at the fabled coal miner Jan Volkanik and the story behind the film Black Fury. By the way, if you like our podcast, thank you for listening, but also be sure to check out, we have a Facebook page. We got a lot of historical photographs, as well as some photos from Bond and Mai's random meanderings through the Commonwealth. Anyhow, as always, feel free to shoot us an email at drpennsylvania@gmail.com.